Hemshech Chaim Beis, Volume 1, the middle of chapter 204, page 415. I'm sorry. Ooh. No, my mistake. We're up to chapter 205, middle of page 417. So what he's explaining now is that to answer the question about Chachmas Tima, that there's two levels and dimension of to answer the question about how the unconsciousness enters into consciousness, he's talking about two dimensions of Chachmas Tima. And he began by saying that there's two levels of concealment, of stima, sosum. One that is relative to the recipients, meaning it's only concealed from the recipient, but it could be revealed to some, it could be revealed more to others, etc. And another that's fundamentally sosum betzim, he called helam ha'atzmus. And to explain it, he began the explanation of the mem and samach of a parsimen. In the word of parsimen, the mem and samach are both closed entities. They're both, one is a square, the mem, stuma that is, the shlos mem as they call it, and the samach, which is also a circle, is also closed. And so the mem and samach are two closed entities. The difference is the circle and the square. So what you have is like this, that one is being a square, it has some form of parameters. We said, like for example, there's no equidistance from the center. The samach, on the other hand, is a circle, so it's completely beyond the structure, which reflects, he said, the two emanations of Hamshacha that's makif. They're both makif because they're closed. One relates and is commensurate to the structure of existence, and the other is beyond the structure of existence. And slowly, meticulously built up what these two levels are. We'll just sum it up. He said the first explanation is, or the first level they explain it, that it's Igulim v'Yesher. So Igulim v'Yesher is generally makif and pnimi, but it's the root of makif and pnimi, obviously, because they're both in the makif here. So he says one is the transcendent energy before the tzimtzum, that's the samach, and that's the igul before the kav, prior to the kav, to the ray of light, and the second is the er hamalbish, that's after the tzimtzum. And generally this is called Tehir Ilah, Tehir Tata, the higher illumination, lower illumination, higher shining, lower shining. More specifically, which we actually learned earlier, Ak is Tehir Tata. But in general, he says, is the Malbish in general. Malbish here, as we said, is the energy as it's already beginning to, the first stage where it's beginning to relate to the structure of existence. So in using the analogy I've been giving, let's say the artist who's going to paint a particular image of 10 spheres, should say the makif is as, right before he does that, there's the hovering desire and the hovering makif that essentially informs what he's about to do. So it's still an all-encompassing entity, like a sealed mem, but it's a mem. It already has parameters, it's already beginning to relate to some structure. Whereas the samach, in this case, would be Tehir Ilah, that's Lifnei HaTzimtzum. So you have Lifnei HaTzimtzum, and after the Tzimtzum, more specifically Ak, Tehir Tata after the Tzimtzum, but in general is the air right after the Tzimtzum, even prior to Ak. Okay. Then, explains the difference between Emek HaMelech and Eitz Chaim, that this is the Emek HaMelech talks about the Er HaMalbish, and the Eitz Chaim talks about the Igul, the circle. Fine. Now, according to the Emek HaMelech, now he goes on to explain this even further. Emek HaMelech says, why is it a square? Because it reflects the four letters of Yud Kei Vav Kei, and their four manifestations in their their four permutations in Ab Sag Ma'am Ban. So four, he implies, is like a square. A square is made up of four sides. So according to this, now we come and it reveals to us more about the level that the mem is. According to this, the Yud Kei Vav Kei, he says, according to another place where it's discussed in Chassidus, that Atchale Nivra Elam Hayahush Me Belvad, which is a Pirkei Medrash, and the question is, what does it mean till the world was created, he and his name were one? So it says that this Shem Havaya, Shem refers to Shem Havaya. So based on this, we see there's Havaya, that this is Lifnei Tzimtzum, because Nivra Elam is already the beginning of creation, the Bria of Ak and so on. So we find now that we've already traced the idea of the Rebuah, of the Mem, Stuma, also before the Tzimtzum. So before the Tzimtzum now, we also have two levels. The Mem would be the Spashta Se'er, as I described that would be in the core of the source. You have, as it relates to the beginning of existence, it's not yet a Tzimtzum, but it's there. And the Samach would be, as he calls it, Etzem Ha'er. Er HaKol Etzem Ha'er. So even though, so we have right there two levels. I describe that as maybe the two levels, that one could be the Shir Atzmei B'Keach, where God envisions in his own mind, so to speak, in his own self. He's already defining, and he already has a Ratzon, has already some type of, he's aware of what he knows, so to speak, as opposed to something that's beyond even the level of awareness. And that would be the level of the Mem. And then there's, prior to that, you could say he's not even aware yet, or maybe a level that he's before that, it comes before it's defined in 10 spheres, maybe it's the infinite spheres. It doesn't specifically state it, but it's called Etzem Ha'er. Now in general, and this is where we have to elaborate more, and I'm going to continue the summary in a moment, is when you speak about Er Lifnei Tzimtzum, you really, there's not much we can really say, because if we could say much, you wouldn't need a Tzimtzum. So we're really just imagining what things would be like, and that we need examples. Like if the Tzimtzum would be the example, if after the Tzimtzum would be an example of an artist that's already placing his paint to his brush to the canvas, so Lifnei Tzimtzum in that mashal example would be the way the art is in his mind or in his being, and all the levels of how an artistic concept evolves from the state of unconsciousness to the state of consciousness until it becomes actually a piece of art. But remember, even Ak, even after the Tzimtzum, Ak is also not a structured existence. It's also the blueprint, but it's all relatively speaking. And we need examples, because the only way we can really relate to it is with examples within ourselves. So if you really wanted to use a microcosm of ourselves, you'd have to go and trace. Let's take the artist example. Trace the artist as he is in his core essence. Etzem Haneshama of the artist. Which you wouldn't even connect to art, you wouldn't even connect to any type of vision. Then if you were able to trace, let's say, I can do this now 50 steps, but let's take 5-6 steps at least. So what do we have? We have the first step would be that it no longer is the etzem begins to manifest in some type of what he calls tainug, delight. Delight is already an expression of the soul, but it's a very, very soulful expression. It's very amorphous, it's very internal, like he said, very behelim, and he spoke about tainug. The tainug then in turn will turn into a ratzon. But I should add that there's levels in between, because then there's the stage right before the desire, and then the stage of the desire, and then there's the stage how the desire begins to relate to the next level. So if you're able to trace how a structured piece of art, a literal physical piece of art, emerged from an artist, you can trace levels that you can call pre-Tzimtzum, post-Tzimtzum, and there too, in each one, many levels. So really to appreciate this well, and to relate to this, we have to use those examples. And after all of it, we still have to qualify it all, and say that that's just a human example, and it's not really what it's like, because obviously, Lifnei Tzimtzum is far greater and beyond existence, much more than an artist's etzem is beyond his art. But fine, those qualifications come part of the process. But at least you begin to realize, and as I said yesterday, it's vital The mindset for understanding Chassidus, you have to constantly think of an evolving process from a very abstract state to a very tangible state. So you see, we live in this world. We live in a static. Our consciousness is very static. Right now we're sitting here. There's a table. There's chairs. There's people. We're learning. And then we know the next thing we're going to do today. Daven, go to work, whatever it may be. These are very linear and very static type of events. We don't see it as a constant fluidity. Even though obviously we're always breathing and our heart is beating and we're alive, but our actions really define our beings. We're essentially, as we grow older, children, by the way, reflect much more the mobility of what the soul is, of this fluidity. They're always moving about. You don't see a child be able to just sit in one space for too long. So we become hardened, and we become, couch potatoes. But even a couch potato moves around once in a while. So, I'm just trying to explain it in a very technical sense. But if you think about it, Chassidus is always telling us there's a dynamic force all the time. First of all, Mechadish B'Tuve B'Chol Yom Tamid Ma'aseh Bereishis, so there's a constant flow of the creative energy from the divine. It's always breathing. Most importantly, for us is to get in touch with that. To be really alive, you have to constantly be in touch with that. You look at the Rebbe, you see constant movement, constant life, constant productivity, and not just like a workaholic productivity. It's just a constant need for movement. It reflects what the divine works. So in other words, if you were to think of a seed growing into a tree, this is happening millions and millions of times every second in existence. Seeds are constantly becoming trees. In our reality, obviously, it takes time. A seed you plant and so on. But if you think of it from the divine point of view, Lifnei HaTzimtzum exists right now, Achar HaTzimtzum exists, Ak is right now here, Atzilus is here, Bria, Yitzir, Asiyah, they're all happening as we speak. Because it's beyond time and space. So then how do we understand it? We understand it as basically multiple dimensions of a reality. So we could all look at the same reality. We can walk into a field right now, and you and I will see, beautiful grass, birds, trees, sky. A botanist may see the different type of species, and a physicist may think about the subatomic particles. You remember those books we used to have in school, like they had maps with the plastic, and every map you put on the topographical map and the layers of maps, and then suddenly you see this is all of the maps in one. You know what I'm talking about? What do they call those? Overlay. They're always fascinating to me because it was showing one reality has so many dimensions to it. So someone looks at a map. Okay, sometimes you see the terrain, the mountains and the valleys. Sometimes you see the temperatures. Sometimes you see the geological structures. You get the whole idea. So Chassidus or Kabbalah talk about all these maps, so it's all happening all at once. And really, it's about understanding that process. And above all, of course, the Avodah is where do you stand? We're always at the bottom of the rung in this material world. The question is where our consciousness relates to. So when a person really davens, they're going through four steps, which is all illness every time they daven. The four rungs of the ladder are the four levels of, sometimes it's Brichas Psukkah de Zimra, or Brichas Shachar, Psukkah de Zimra, the Hagdama to Shema, Brichas Krishma, Shema and Shemon Esrei. Sometimes it's distinguished differently. Like the story with the Maggid. Then his chaver, when they were younger, they learned together Kabbalah. He came and sees the Maggid, he's davening and davening. So he finally waited till he finished. The story. It's a famous story. The Rebbe repeated it many times. So he came over to the Maggid. He says, Shalom Aleichem. We haven't seen each other for so long. Maggid, where do you? We used to learn together Kabbalah, Nigla, and everything. And it takes me an hour. You daven 4 or 5 hours. Now this man had become a businessman. So the Maggid asked him, what do you do with your life? So he says, he goes a few times a year. He goes to the market, to the main Leipzig, to the main marketplace, and buys scheirer material, and then comes back and sells it to local merchants. And now he lives the rest of the time. He's learning and davening. And Maggid says to him, "How long does it take you to take good travel?" He says, "It's a month of my life. A month every twice a year or something like that." And she says, "Why do you have to take all the bother travel? Stay home, close your eyes, and meditate about how you go to Leipzig, how you buy the material, how you come back, and how you sell it." She says, "Maggid, you're a batlin. You have to have the scheirer. You need the material. To get the material, you have to go there." So Maggid answered the same thing with the davening. You need this, and need the scheirer. If you need the scheirer, it's not an hour trip. It's a much longer trip. The point is that someone davens properly, they're going through these levels all the way as far as they can go. Obviously, each of us is in a different space and a different level. So it just shows us how far we are from this. That's the real bottom line. I'm not saying it to knock us. It's just, if you want to face reality, this is real. For people who read this is meant to be traveled through. And everyone on their level, you can say, okay, I'm not by Ak, I'm only holding by Atzilus. You have all the levels within you at any time. It could be your Aveda right now is going from Yitzira to Bria, fine. But it's, first of all, it's consciousness states. Second of all, it's refinement states. Remember, it's not just a mathematical thing, okay, now I understand the seed level as opposed to the tree level. You become more refined, more divine as you climb. More achdus, more unity, more calm for that matter, more focus, and I can go through a whole series of things. More aligned. Basically, it's from fragmentation to unity is the general picture as you climb. But each level has its purpose. Now, of course, the kavanah is dir b'tachteinim, to do it from our world where you're disconnected and connect. But the connection itself, as I said, is many connections. I'm just summing up the interface in a context that this is not just levels we're talking about here. So to go back now to what he's talking about, that's why I was giving examples of our own self. That you can find this whole picture from Lifnei Tzimtzum, from Etzem, all the way to the outside expression that we're talking about here, the Mem Stuma and the Samach within ourselves. And each has its role. The higher level, obviously, is less shaped and less structured. The lower level is more structured, but less, lack of a better word, less bittul, less divine, less unified. And obviously you need both. So climbing this ladder here, I use the example artist for some reason it speaks to me. But you can use any example. I mean, obviously the same example could be a writing, conceiving, but you need something that has an end product and begins somewhere.
Creative.
Yeah, some type of creative something. Or else, you could talk about anything. You could talk about having a meal, obviously, but you need something that you can hold on to. And frankly, in Chassidus, anything that relates to you, that you can find an example that relates and is consistent with the picture, obviously with all the qualifications I made. There's always qualifications, because no example is going to be a perfect example. Example at best is going to be a mirror image on a lower level of something on a greater level. And especially when you talk about Lifnei Tzimtzum, that becomes increasingly difficult because we're extrapolating. The only reason we can talk about it is because the Rebbe Rashab talks about it. And but frankly, as I said, there's no talking without a Tzimtzum. We wouldn't be here to talk about it. So to talk about something we wouldn't be here without it is itself is somewhat of a conundrum. Because what does that mean? Without the Tzimtzum, we wouldn't hear to talk about it. And we're talking before the Tzimtzum as if we're like residents, But because God does want to unite with us, and we do have a partnership, and He's revealing to us what happened before the Tzimtzum, even that you could talk about. But you have to qualify properly, or else you diminish it. So don't ever think that before the Tzimtzum, because we're talking about it, it's like we talk about after the Tzimtzum. It's really two different paradigms. So what we're doing is that before the Tzimtzum, you have to think of it. Imagine someone talking to the artist based on the art. He's going to talk about the etzem and the shama of the artist. It would be somewhat rude, somewhat unnerved to do that. But that doesn't mean there's no revelation. I would say it's almost like this: if you go in with the right qualification and bittul, that I have no mastery here, and I just want to hear, you'll be able to absorb some of the pre-Tzimtzum consciousness. But if you think you're a whole big mumche, an expert, and I'm just marching right in, you will then be annihilated, because pre-Tzimtzum doesn't leave room for existence. So you almost have to go into a place of non-existence within yourself to be able to experience, I would say, pre-Tzimtzum. So you can imagine how difficult that is to do. We have enough problems with bittul hayesh in olam hasiyah chumri, let alone enter a place like that. But yet, the whole point of we're discussing that the mind, Chochmas Tima, and the conscious mind and the unconscious mind are able to dream. We could dream of that. So even though emotionally we cannot say I could enter a pre-Tzimtzum place because I wouldn't exist, but you could extrapolate. You could dream. You could imagine. We have all kinds of fantasies. So we might as well have a fantasy about pre-Tzimtzum fantasy. So our mind is able to explore it. But again, you have to constantly qualify that it's nothing that you think it is. It's like saying, if you think it's like that, it's really not even like that instead. So basically, Nevertheless, Chassidus clearly says, like he says here, he says, even though b'chlolosh, b'chinas eira kol b'atzmusei, that's why I'm elaborating. In general, as soon as you talk lifnei tzimtzum, remember the words of the Eitz Chaim are like this. The energy, divine energy, encompassed kol makam achol, mamak mala kol hametzias. It filled everything that would become existence. There was no existence yet, and there was no room for anything to emerge. So tzimtzum atzmei, it says he's contracted and concealed the light. I'm going back to the original, the expression Eitz Chaim tzimtzum. He concealed it, and now left a black hole, an empty void. Again, this is a mashal, but just a mashal. The classic example, which is straight from the Alter Rebbe, is the teacher. Teacher has to convey something who's into an infinitely lower student, infinite distance. He can't just minimize the flow. He has to completely silence. He has to withdraw anything he's saying, teacher, completely prepare, and then comes a narrow ray, which is the kav. I mean, that's the classic post-Tzimtzum reality. Okay, so anything before the kav is a teacher in silence. Even though in his mind and in his spirit he wants to convey to the student, but for all practical purposes, there has to be a moment of silence. A moment of solitude, what's the word I wanted to put? Stillness. Yeah, a moment of stillness. And I say moment, I don't mean moment as in time, I mean a state of stillness. And that precedes the flow. So he's saying everything is era kol b'atzmusei. So how could we talk about levels there? Nevertheless, he says clearly, because the whole point of the tzimtzum is there should be, so to speak, a revelation outside of his core, which means that so prior everything is within. Nevertheless, specifically there are levels. Now, can you give me a chelik? Which chelik is it? Chelik Tezvav. The Rebbe talks about this, about levels before the Tzimtzum. And he has a letter here. There's a very interesting letter. I just want to read it because I think it would be helpful to understand this. So here he was asked by, I think it was Yisrael Neach. He was living in Paris. Tafshin Tes. This letter is before the Nesius. This is 1949. It's page, volume 15, 473, 474. So he asked like this. The question to the Rebbe was, how could there be before the Tzimtzum? The Eitz Chaim clearly says it's a pashut, which means a seamless, plain energy. Everything is equalized. Maina. So it's a form of shalom maina, question answer. And the Rebbe answers. I'm reading literally the Rebbe's answer. What it says in Eitz Chaim, that it's pashut. Now remember the word pashut, we usually define as simple. But simple also means plain, meaning seamless. Use uniform. But pashut is better, almost abstract. Pure. I mean, there's a lot of ways to interpret it. But here pashut means, the opposite of pshitus would be shaped, tzir. Pshitus and tzir would be the antonym in this context. So the truth is when we say ish pashut, his simplicity, his innocence, connects to the innocence of Atzmus, we talk about that. But we talk the pshitus, we don't mean simple as opposed to complex, or simple as like an ignorant. We don't mean, sometimes you say in Asham Pshutim, people who are not scholars and not so on. Even that the Baal Shem Tov says their simplicity, their innocence touches, like you say, a child is not yet knowledgeable. So there's an element of that. But here, pshittus really means as opposed to structure, as opposed to definition. It's almost non-definition. I like seamless personally because to me it's like that type of like just a flow of one entity. It's almost like a field of energy when we talk a field as opposed to particles, a wave. Anyway, so the Rebbe says when you say on that there's pashut, he says it's be'erech, talking relative to ishtalshalos. So the Rebbe says, not just relative to the worlds. Even compared to the conceptual kedima v'ichra would be hierarchy of Kedima v'Ichur means it's not an actual physical, one thing precedes the other. We talked about conceptual time and conceptual cause and effect. So we say Kedima meaning even prior. So it's not prior just to the structure of Ishtalshalos. Whereas, for example, relative to our world where there's time and space, that's Pashut, because there's no time and space there. He's saying even relative to conceptual time and space. Because all these levels can happen through the Tzimtzum. So bottom line is, the Rebbe's first initial answer is relative. It's not finished there, because it's not a complete answer, obviously. Nevertheless, the Rebbe says, Eina Pashat Hamiti. Meaning, so therefore, it's not really Pashat Hamiti. You can't really say it's true seamlessness. Relative to that level, just to give, does he give an example? Yeah, I'll give an example. Like I mentioned before, relative to, let's say, me speaking right now words, my thought is pshittus. Even though if you break my thought down, you also find specifics. But relative to actual, the letters of speech, or even more, the letters of writing, are tangible compared to the levels of writing, the levels of compared to the letters, written letter, the spoken, and definitely the letters of thought are pshittus. That's basically what he's saying. Fine. But because you can't call it real Pashat Hamiti. You can't call it completely, true fundamental pshittus.
There's still pshita and not pshita.
Right, exactly. Yeah, but he's going to, one second. I'm reading intentionally because I think it's important to understand this whole piece we're learning now. Then he goes, and you have to say this, ki pshitas be'emes hainu agdas hapshuta. Because true pshittas is utter unity. Again, it says Agdus Apshuta, so we're talking about seamless unity. Which means She'iyav Shalemer by Shnei Inyanim. When you say Pshutas Amiti, you mean you can't say two things. You can't even talk about two things. And anything in existence except Atzmos Mamish Yesh Beis Inyanim. L'chol hapachas. Anything except Atzmos has two things, at least two things. The Rebbe says what? Hadavar. The thing and what brought it into being. So anything except Atzmus has a cause, basically. As soon as you say it has a cause, you're talking about a duality. Now, obviously, he's talking very subtle duality, but he's talking about a dual minimum. He says l'chol hapachas, the Rebbe underlines at least two. Just like Eir before the Tzimtzum. Yesha Eir v'kayach hamoyer sheboy. There's the Eir itself, and there's the kayach hamoyer, the power of the source of the Eir. And the air is davuk, is attached to the moyer. So yes, the air is completely connected, it's not separate, but there's air and there's the source of it. As soon as you say air lifnei tzimtzum, you're already saying two things. Air, and what the air comes from somewhere. So bottom line, the Rebbe established here is that it's relative, and besides atzmus, everything has a minute. You can't say pshittus amiti on anything. Now the Rebbe continues. It's a fascinating letter. So it's a tremendous explanation. The Rebbe applying himself to explain this. Now he's going to give. There's several examples that you can give to something that is seamless compared to lower levels. In other words, how do we? Like I gave the example of thought, but so there's different examples. The Rebbe is going to give now several examples of something that compared to lower we would say is seamless or non-shaped, but even though compared to higher it's murkav. By the way, Pashat and murkav is also, Pashat would mean, murkav is a composite. I think in chemistry, I don't know the word for it. When you talk about an isolated isotype, what is it called? An isolated isotope. There's an isolated entity that is considered to be like plain. And then most elements are a combination of several molecules. But if you're able to isolate a molecule, like for example, water is H2O, so it's two parts of hydrogen.
It's in a compound.
A compound is murkav. Yeah. Pshittus is non-compound, basically. So he's saying that's the word he's using here. I said before tzir, but murkav is maybe even in the language of chikira, murkav and pashut go together. So murkav would mean a composite of a compound and non-compound. So we're saying that there's several examples to explain something that is non-compound to relative to below, but it's a compound relative to higher levels, which is essentially what he said is air before the tzimtzum. And he gives you first example he gives, and this is something we learned in Ayin Beis a number of times. This goes back to, today it's not scientific science as they speak about it today, but the concept is there. Lidal you say this. So Eish Ruach Mayim Offer, not as opposed to popular misconception, is not fire, water, earth, and air in the literal sense. It's archetypes. These are 4 archetypes. It's almost like when we speak about an electron, a neutron, and a proton. So they're not. They're mostly archetype. What I mean by that is everything in existence has that. So it's not, just we talk about linear fire and so on. So bottom line, these are archetypes. They are pshutim, essentially shapeless compared to all the creatures. But compared to the Chemer HaYuli, which precedes the 4, where you have, let's say, one nucleus, before it's even received the 4 archetypes, like think of it like a raw piece of clay, and there's not even yet the HaYuli, the potential for the 4 dimensions, and we learned this literally in Ayin Beis. Imam spoke about these 2 levels. Huh? Okay, the Rebbe, I'm not going to quote the sources. He now says Rei Rambam, Ramban, Eitz Chaim, and Bat Kodesh. The Rebbe gives 4 sources to look up. Another example: Haneshama mislabeshes beguf. The soul, as it manifests in the body, she pshuta be'erkei. Compared to the body, the soul is what do we say? Non-compound. He says, look in Tanya chapter 51. Umurkev is be'erech etzam neshama. But it's murkev, it's a compound compared to the essence of the core soul. Karihi mischalekes neran chai. Because the soul breaks into nefesh, ruach, neshama, chai, yechida. V'oid. The Rebbe gave 2 examples. Okay. Now the Rebbe continues. And this is where it gets lebedik. The Rebbe says like this. Ubechlolos ube'emek. And in general, and ube'emek means in depth. Like, he's going deeper into the topic. B'tzad ha-beira, from the perspective of the Beira, of the Creator, hini hakolu pashut b'tachos hapshitis. Everything is seamless. The way the Creator looks at the creation, everything is one field. Because everything is nothing but that. Nothing exists but Him. So it's all God, all divinity, all godliness. Bli kol chiluk im lamayla aden kates or lamata aden tachlis. Without any difference, if it's high all the way, infinitely high, or endlessly low. Umetzad hagiluyim, and from the perspective of giluyim, which means we're talking about not etzem giluyim, hari hakol hu murkav. Everything is a compound or canal. So now the Rebbe introduced this, in other words, of pre-tzimtzum. It's a little deeper than what he said before. Before, he said it's relative. Now he's saying, really, from divine perspective, you always have real pshitus. And from existence perspective, or you can say from an expression perspective, you have these differences. Now he continues, and he gives a dugman avodah. V'dugmose ba'avodah. Ba'avodah amitis, in true avodah, Hainu evet poshet, she'ena mitzias klal atzmei, which means an evet poshet. Poshet is using. This is some samach vav. Evet poshet means a simple servant. He's not there's an evet neman, it's called. An evet neman is a servant with intelligence and so on. Evet poshet is completely surrendered himself to serve the divine. He's not a mitzias at all on his own. Kol inyan pshutim betachos hapshitis. All his things are simple with utter simplicity, utter. What do we say? Non-shaped. Hechsher mitzvah, mitzvah d'rabbanan, mitzvah d'araisa, en kol chilik etzlei klal. Whether he's doing a hechsher mitzvah, which is only preparing to do a mitzvah, or a mitzvah of the rabbanan, or a mitzvah d'araisa, he's a servant. This is what he told me to do. This is what I do. There's no distinctions in his being in true Aveda, because he's completely bottled. Like I said many times, the person who's like the chief of staff, All his job is to convey what God wants. You tell me to go chop wood, I chop wood. You tell me to go prepare a knife for a bris. So it's not a mitzvah, but it's a hechsher. I do that. You want me to go bake matzah? It's all hechsher mitzvah. You tell me to put on film? I put on film. A mitzvah d'Rabbanan, Chanukah. For him, it's all equal. All pashut. Because all that matters is he's not a mitzvah for himself. It's not what he feels or what he is. All that matters is that the rotzen is that. So he's completely
divine perspective. You did.
Exactly. In Aveda, that's the person putting himself in the divine perspective. One second. Kikulim and legabe hemrak mitzias adon. Because all of them, compared to for him, are just mitzias adon. The mitzias, the existence of the master. That's all that matters. Ein eid milvade. It's what the master wants. What does he care if it's called a mitzvah, it's a hechsher mitzvah, it's a hechsher mitzvah. We're talking about this level of complete utter bittul, obviously. Okay. The Rebbe continues. So it's giving it. And the fact that in the mitzvah of the Raisa, for example, a suffix you machmir, and by the Rabbanon a suffix you mekel. So you see what I mean. There is a distinction in his behavior. If it was, let's say, a Deraisa mitzvah, if it's a doubt, he's going to be stricter. If it's a Rabbanon, he's going to be lenient. Or other differences that are similar. It's not that there's this that he's distinguishing between the mitzvahs. The Rebbe writes niris in quotation. He's basically saying that there's no difference to him. It's only that the Metzias Ha'adam, the existence of the master, the way he's reflected in Krishma, the same way he's reflected in the difference between a suffix of Rabbana and a suffix of Deraisa. That itself is part of the divine will. So what does he care? In other words, it's not because he's wise and he's saying, okay, let me think about it this way. That's what God wants. That's what the master wants. He wants this should be kula, this should be chumrah. So in other words, even the distinctions are not really distinct in his presence because he does it all with the same passion, basically. There's no difference in how he does. It's like we say, we learned about this, mitzvah kala ka mitzvah chamura. I would call it kala chamura, because on the level of existence and structure, yes, this is kala, this is chamura. You can't compare the two. But on the level of the adon, the bittul of the source, for God, he wants them both. It's both his ratzon, and therefore it's a total equality in that level. So the Rebbe's example, me'ein dugme b'teira haniglas. The Rebbe says to give an example in Nigla. La Rambam kol hatzivum d'Rabbanan hem ha'teira. According to the Rambam, all the mitzvahs of Rabbanan are sanctioned by the Raisa. El Sharabanan dahainu mahatera l'shita zu tziva l'chalik b'neim. The only thing is that the Rabbanon, which means according to the Torah says, I distinguish between what the rabbis decreed and what the Torah itself says. But he's giving a me'ain dugma, it's me'ain underline. It's an example would be that according to the Rambam, when you do, let's say, mitzvahs Chanukah or brachas or other things that are eruvin, that are the Rabbanon, it's also the Torah. But the Torah itself distinguished and said, this is min Torah, this is min Rabbanon. That's the example the Rebbe gives. I'm not going to study this in old. I'm just giving. It's all an example for Pshittas Naveda. Now, one more paragraph. It's almost done here. That's an Eved Poshet. All other types of Aveda, of people, except the one I just mentioned, the one we just mentioned, Hakol Baba Hakova. Everything comes as a compound. Or L'chol HaPochos Mishnayim. And at minimum two things. Mekayim HaMitzvah, the performer of the mitzvah, v'ha-mitzvah atzma, and the mitzvah itself. Right there you have dual. So only the Eved Poshet, who's so completely and utterly bottled to the Adon, has no distinctions. Because he has no tzias for himself. V'yesh l'hayre b'chol, the Rebbe concludes. Yes, there is need to elaborate on all this. Im yede'eni asher muksha be'eze inyan. If you let me know that if any difficulty in anything I've said from above. So I hope he followed up and asked. But anyway, then the Rebbe writes ha'ara. This is the punchline. Nothing is left without a question. Ein kamakeme. Here is not the place levaya to explain masha ein amuvun, that which is not understood l'chayr, seemingly. Lifnei ad tzimtzum, before the tzimtzum, mahu eisa chilukim ba'er. Before the tzimtzum, what causes there to be distinctions in the air? Kivin shein sham elohu u'shmei bolvad. Being that there's nothing but He and His name alone. That the Rebbe concludes with that, leaves us with that question. Now the truth is, he's really hinting to the answer by saying Hu v'shmei.
Two things.
Yeah, but still, the question is, where is the first harkava happen? If you're dealing with complete divine unity, utter unity, you have to answer because Atzmus has the koyach hagvul, just like he has the koyach habligvul. That's ultimately probably the answer. That just like what? Because who says utter unity is the ultimate shlemus? That's also to us we relate to it as being beyond this fragment, the fragmentation of existence, unity. But you have to say that Atzmus himself also has the power to create, so to speak, a compound. Just as the power, because look, it's the general rule even in science. If everything is made up of compound, and you trace it to some first source, that first thing could not create a compound if it doesn't have a compound within itself. How did it break into two? What chemical reaction causes something that is seamless to become two? Unless you say that's really not seamless, and in there was the potential. In other words, if you had a seamless seed and you put it into the ground, it's not growing into a tree. You have to say, in the seed you have all the elements. But that the Rebbe says Ein Kamakein, it doesn't explain. But bottom line is, I thought it was appropriate to bring because it's literally explaining what he's saying here. That's Kolashu Oira Kolabatz Musa, and nevertheless there's levels. So what do we know from this? That there's levels, and there's two ways to explain it. One, it's relative to what comes after the Tzimtzum, and deeper, it's the divine perspective. In other words, Lifnei Tzimtzum, divine consciousness is what dominates. And divine consciousness, like the Evet Poshet, sees everything as one. If you look at it from the perspective of below, or it doesn't say below, but perspective of Giluyim, then even Lifnei Tzimtzum, you can talk about two levels. So this itself is a powerful way. Remember, we talked about tracing things to the source. If you ask the artist, can you tell me this piece of art that I see inside your consciousness, is it like different than other pieces of art? There's a state in his being who'll say it's all one thing by me. It's all part of one vision. And you just happen to see one glimpse of me. So from his perspective, in a certain level, the whole thing is one part of his essence. Then there's a part of him that applied himself and said, okay, I'm going to create this piece of art. That's already not the Borer looking at it from the Borer perspective, that's already the Borer, the creator, looking at it from the creation's perspective. And that would be called Giluyim. So Lifnei Tzimtzum, really what dominates essentially is divine consciousness. That's why you need a Tzimtzum. That's why you need a Tzimtzum. Because the Tzimtzum creates another consciousness. But if you break it down really, beforehand, there's also within the divine consciousness, God is preparing that there'll be another consciousness. And that is where we talked about distinctions. So you're talking about in the divine consciousness how He sees our consciousness that will emerge after the Tzimtzum. Now remember, again, this is not in time. So it's just really just two stages of our being. So you got to give it some thought.
Two questions. The Evet Pashat, how doesn't he still have duality in his life, that he's the Ratzon of the Adon, but also the Pula that he's doing?
Here it looks like no. It's like simply what it says sometimes, that the arm of the master is his arm. In Evet, well, he says clearly, utter Evet Pashat. He says these words. Veda mitzvah hainu Evet Pashat she'eina mitzias klal la'atzmei.
But he still has to have consciousness, no? He has to realize that there's a
not an Evet Pashat. Not necessarily.
Differentiated world that he has to deal in. If the Adon tells him to go check something,
no,
he's still got the...
Not in this level of Evet Pashat. This level of Evet Pashat is...
So then there's no that exists, no?
No, but he relates, every little thing he does has a relation to, this is what God
right,
wills.
But he
does different things.
So once he starts doing some interacting with the different things, it's already differentiated. It's already fragmented. Even though it has a unifying kavana.
It's all from God, though. It's His head.
No, the bittul is utter bittul. It's the avoid of utter bittul, where there is no distinction at all, not between him and the master, and not between anything he does. He asked me if he's God. No, he's not God. Obviously, he's not God, because the Rebbe is giving an example of the perspective of the Borer. It's not we're talking about God Himself. He's trying to give an example. This is all an avoid, an example of compare it to the relative, and you'll see the difference. The other person is as a whole. There's levels. The Eved Posh is the deepest you can go. I mean, it's an Avodah. At the end of the day, it's an example. The Rebbe says, Dugmose ba'Avodah. An example for this in Avodah. So the ultimate, think of it, the most possible bittul.
Right.
And using the words here, he says that, Ein kol chiluk etzlei klal. Yeah, is there an etzlei? Is there a physical human being? Yes, there is. But that's not relative to, but in Avodah, there's no physical human being. That's the point here. Obviously, in the physicality, you see this person.
Right.
That's not a question that about duality. But his Avodah, there's no person. In his consciousness, there's no separate consciousness. You're not talking about a shliach who is a bar das b'fnei atzmei. An Eved can't be a shliach, for example. This type of servant can't be a shliach. Is someone who's an independent entity with his own intelligence and comes and becomes completely dedicated. I'll do your shlichus, and then he's also shluchas shalom kamesei. But it's a shliach. He's a bar das. An Eved is not that.
An Eved cannot be a shliach?
No. A ben or Eved cannot be a shliach. That's why there's opinion that he's a shadchan, not a shliach. A real, yeah. Also, some say he freed. This is mefurish. This whole they say that he freed him in order to become a shliach.
This week's portion.
Yeah. There's opinion that he freed him. There's a whole sikh. Chayesar nun beis to the Kinnis HaShluchim, the last sikh talks about this at length. There's opinion that he freed him beforehand in order to give him the power of attorney, so to speak.
So you mean if a person gives a get to his Eved to give the woman, that's not a proper shlichus?
He would have to free him. He would have to free him to be, yeah.
And if he gives a get to his
there's
son,
there's a whole halachas on this.
That's what I'm saying.
Son also
his
not.
Son also can't be a shliach for them.
Or sheitah, cheresh or sheitah v'kotten, also, who have no das. Your shliach has to be a bar das. Because if not, there's all kinds of problems. You give it to someone who, they have to be an entity. The Rebbe speaks about shlichus. The Rebbe would not, a shliach has to be out there and use his seichel and figure out what to do with his own tools. If he was an Eved, he wouldn't be able to do that. Now, he could choose to be bottled completely. A shliach could be like ben shenas Eved, is the expression. A shliach or a ben can become so bottled like an Eved.
But then, so why aren't shluchim called avadim? Why would the
Because that's exactly, he doesn't want to have that.
But didn't we just say that the highest level is an Eved because he's reaching this level of undifferentiated, unfragmented, total bittul to Eibishter, total bittul. If you would want, that's only an Eved. Once you say you're shliach, you already just said he has to be bardas, independent. You automatically say that if you have shluchim, it seems to say
you can't figure out an answer. Why did God create a world altogether? Why don't you start with that? Anyway, let's go back to Ayin Beis, because what you asked me is, why did God create a world? Why didn't He just leave it completely? I asked you a question. Why didn't He just leave everything before the Tzimtzum? Why did He create a world? According to you, He shouldn't have created a world, so we don't have all these problems. The whole point is that there should be a separate, and that person should choose to become Batal.
Ultimately, we have no idea anyway.
Okay, anyway. So the bottom line is...
One quick question. That artist analogy that you used, Lifnei Tzimtzum, in the analogy of the artist, is... You would think that it would be before you're not even relating to him as an artist. You're relating to him something beyond artistry, the fact that he's an artist, right? You're relating to him just as an existence. Is that what a point of relation?
That's a higher level. There's many levels in there. There's also could be an artist that has infinite ways of expressing his art. There's also another level, and then there's beyond being artists, and then there's beyond being an artist. You can go as many levels as you like. I just use it to try to explain these levels. You have to just know what to associate. But there's also the level where he can make infinite art, Esfiris Ein Ketz, and then he chooses one. The Bli Gvul possibilities chooses one possibility. That too is inside the artist. That's the lower levels. Okay, so we have here now, Makol Malkum Deraplat, there's two levels, is Pashtu Se'er or Etz Me'er? Huh?
It's 9 o'clock.
Let me just... Ubchinas is Pashtu Se'er. Now he says, Pashtu Se'er, which is Atzil, is the call is Shem Havaya. That's what we learned. And Etz Me'er would be... in this case, the Samach, which would mean higher than Shem Havaya. So Hem Havaya is a square, the Mem. Then he continues, the Rebbe Rashab goes even deeper. and says Etzem Ha'er and Hispashtus Ha'er both are Havaya. One is Yudke and Vavke. So Yudke is beyond the relationship in the analogy I'm giving. Remember, now we're talking levels, so we're not talking the pshitas that I said from the Beir's perspective, because then everything is equal. But Lifnei HaTzimtzum, relative to after the Tzimtzum, or in the context of Giluyim, you have these levels. Sometimes it's explained, by the way, that Lifnei HaTzimtzum it's all equal. But after the Tzimtzum, like think of a seed. In a seed, apple seed, you can't tell the difference between, there's no difference between a bark and a trunk and a branch and a leaf and a fruit. It's all in there in some state. And then, when it emerges, you realize it was there. So some explain the Lifnei HaTzimtzum like that too. Lifnei HaTzimtzum, you can't distinguish between anything. But after the Tzimtzum, you see something, Mamala Kalam, Seva Kalam, you see structures, so you realize that Lifnei HaTzimtzum must have been two levels like that. So it's almost like a extrapolation from after, but just another way of putting it here. So there's Yudke Vavke. And that's, both of them is Shem Havaya. ובחלוסה הוא בחינת שמי הכל בעצמוסה וכל זה הוא בער כמו שהוא בחינת המשכים מן העצמוס יש בזה בחינת עצם הער that's not yet the Gili Vispashtus or bchinas Vispashtus here. And that's the root of Seva Akalam and Mamala Kalam after the Tzimtzum. Then he says there's another level now, Ir Hakol Batzmuseh. And that's not even a Hamshachah from Atzmus at all. He's going to call this Kodem K'Kamitzin. He's going to call this Yechelis. He's revealing now a new level, which is Yechelis means God's ability. Now, interesting that Tzemach Tzedek writes that Yechelis was an expression that Alter Rebbe used at the end of his life to explain a deeper level how all this is within Atzmus. Now, we just said, isn't all this before the Tzimtzum? But before the Tzimtzum, as we just described, there's the way the artist is already relating to what he's going to create. And there you have two things, Etzem and Eir. That's why I'm using this analogy. When you say within Atzmus, you must be speaking now in the Etzem of the artist. He's not even an artist yet. There's nothing at all, but he has the ability to do it all.
It's Atzmus, not Atzmus saying stuff. It's Atzmus.
It's always Atzmus saying stuff. We never talk about Atzmus.
Okay.
But anyway, Eir Kol Batzmus is called Yechelis. No, but this is but because Atzmus is built to Mitzias Nimtzu, you can't talk about levels. Okay, he says here Shmoi Kadem Kekadmusei. Now you say the Eir here is as original as Atzmus itself because there's no Eir yet. So when you say God and God's potential to express light, can you distinguish between the two? Can you say that God came first and then his potential came second? No, his potential goes together with him because it's his shleimus. That's what he's saying here. On real Eir, once the artist is already thinking of some expression, once he's already some expression, you can't call that Kadmon. That's already the entity, the Etzem, choosing to become an artist. Shadihu Gilead Etzeni. And the light energy is revealed with Ratzon. This is, God forbid to say, he has to express himself.
You will do them.
Right. And every Gilead Etzeni is Ki'ilu Kadma Heder. Ki'ilu Kadma Heder, we discussed that the previous time. I just want to explain what it means. It means, there's an expression, Kadma Heder means that something's preceded, a state of being was preceded by not being, by a state of non-being. But sometimes you can't call it preceded by a state of non-being, you say Ki'ilu Kadma Heder. Because you can't say it is always here, it's a result of the source, so you say it's like as if a state of non-being preceded it. An example given, for example, is think of an infinite pole that casts an infinite shadow. So you can't say the shadow was preceded by no shadow, because as soon as there's a pole, there's a shadow. It goes automatic. But you can't say that the shadow is the cause of the pole. So you say Ki'ilu Kadma Heder. So in time, or in any other way, you'd say they come together, but one is the cause of another. That's this deeper state that he's talking about. But the Eir, Kameshu B'chinas Yechelis Levad, Kamei B'hechach Lemer, B'zeh B'hechach Lemer Shdei Kadma Kekadmusei. On this level, you have to say that it's like Kadma Kadmusei, meaning it's as original as how do you say Kadma? I don't like primordial. When you say kadman means something is...
Primeval. I don't know, that's
No, when you say kadman means it has no beginning, basically. It was always there. So, just as our God is always the source, this is also always there with him, so to speak.
Prime. The word is prime.
Prime?
Primeval.
Primeval. So prime like he is. So in other words, now we're talking about a level of Oir that's mamish in the Yechelis Ha'atzmos. And that he's going to say, Bepashtus, is now the Samach, I would assume. So we have to stop here, right, according to our schedule. Okay. So we reviewed this, but it's with more explanation, chapter 205. Again, page 416 and 417. Up next class, we'll finish this chapter.